I am Leslie Johnson. I am the manure educator for the state of Nebraska and at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And I am part of the Soil Health Nexus, have been for a long time. So the Digital Café series is a program that we developed actually during COVID to try and continue our reach from the Soil Health Nexus team. And we're a university-led team that's dedicated to increasing access to research-based soil health information, knowledge extension, and any sort of resources. The team is from the North Central region and includes representatives from 12 states in that North Central region. So how this typically works, we will have a presentation followed by a question and answer time. You are welcome during the Q&A time to open your microphone and ask that question out loud, or you can put it into the chat box and I will do my best to moderate that for our speaker. Following that Q&A time, we will have breakout rooms and you'll be able to click into the room that you so choose. And if you're struggling with that, by all means, let us know either through the chat box or by turning on your microphone and let us know, and we can assign you to the room that you want. We will have rooms for researchers, for extension educators, or other educators. We'll have agency folks in a room and you are welcome if you fit in one of those categories, but you want to hear the other one, it's okay to select the other room. We will have a grower farmer room, and then we also have a room available for students to chat with each other. So today we have Dr. Deirdre Griffin LaHue, who is here from Washington State University, and where she is a professor of soil health and sustainable soil management. And she's going to give us an update on the state of the soils and the soil health assessment across Washington's diverse soils and systems. During that digital cafe, during that discussion time, you are welcome to you're going to discuss things like what you thought of the topic, any current research that supports or disclaims what Dr. Deirdre discussed, and how you're going to use that information in your programming and research. And if you have suggestions for any future topics for the webinars, by all means, let somebody know, and we will definitely pursue that. We have taken a lot of our speakers' names from our audience. So one more thing, in 2 weeks, we are hosting the Haskell Ag Lab Soil Health School, which is here in Nebraska. It's actually at my home base in Concord, Nebraska. And we have 2 days of soil health in service where you can learn about the basics of soil health. You can learn about different demonstrations that you can do to help teach soil health. It is a collaboration with Nebraska Extension, the Soil Health Nexus team, as well as NRCS. So we are taking registrations still for that, but we would really like those in as soon as possible. There is no cost to attending that 2-day program. There is an additional cost if you want to join us for our evening meeting and supper, as well as there's an optional tour on August 3rd. So I would encourage you to check it out. The website there is go.unl.edu/HAL, as in Haskell Ag Lab, SHS for Soil Health School. And I will stick that in the chat box as soon as I turn it over to Dr. Griffin LaHue. And which is exactly what I'm going to do now. So I will stop sharing here and you can just take it away, Dr. LaHue.
Great, thank you. Let me just share my screen. All right, well, yeah, thanks so much for having me today. I'm glad to get connected with this group. So I'm going to be talking about our state of the soils assessment going on in Washington. And yeah, as was mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of soil health at WSU and going to be talking about some of the things we have going on in Washington. But first, I want to acknowledge my collaborators. This has really been a big team effort, particularly my collaboration with Dr. Danny Gilardi, who's a senior soil scientist at the Washington State Department of Ag. and along with other scientists at the Department of Ag as well, JD Ryan and Leslie Michael. And then my students, Kobe Sarpong and Molly McElwam, who were in charge of a bulk of this work, and as well as conservation district partners across the state. So I'm first going to give an overview of the Washington Soil Health Initiative and activities and programs that have been going on with that initiative over the past few years. And then I'm going to talk about one of those projects, which is the State of the Soils Assessment. We're still really in the midst of this project. So I'm going to be talking about, what we've been doing, some preliminary findings, what we're kind of thinking about with this data, and what we plan to do moving forward. And then just end with some other information about some resources so you can follow along with the Washington Soil Health Initiative. So this Soil Health Initiative is a tri-agency collaboration between the Washington State Conservation Commission, the State Department of Ag, and WSU. And it was a legislatively funded initiative in 2021, really focused on promoting research, outreach, technical assistance, education, policy support, and funding opportunities to support soil health in Washington State. There's 4 primary goals, which are to increase awareness of soil health in the state among a variety of stakeholders, to document the state of the soils, which is what I'll be talking about, improve understanding of soil health building practices, and to increase adoption of those soil health building practices by creating programs that are going to support the farmers in the state. So we have an incredibly diverse state in terms of the soils that are here and in terms of the climatic conditions. So, we range from within Washington, the deep windblown silts of the Palouse in eastern Washington. We have very coarse arid soils in the Columbia Basin, which is a largely irrigated specialty crop region, incredibly sandy soils. And then we have relatively young floodplain and volcanic soils up in northwestern Washington, where I'm located, where we have, a variety of bulb and potato and vegetable seed crops. So, as I've mentioned, not only are our soils incredibly diverse, but we grow a huge diversity of crops in the state. And so in order to effectively kind of determine how to address soil health across these climatic conditions, across soil types, across cropping systems, we started off the Soil Health Initiative work by developing a roadmap. So we divided the state up into different kind of industry groups and conducted listening sessions, interviews, focus groups to really identify what are the main challenges to soil health, the kind of milestones that the knowledge gaps, and then the milestones that each group wanted to address. And if you're interested in looking at our soil health roadmap, I'm happy to share these slides, and there's going to be a series of QR codes throughout this presentation, but you can access the roadmap online. So as I mentioned, the roadmap focuses on key challenges, which included things like wind and water erosion, water holding capacity, compaction, pest and disease pressure, acidification, and these, of course, really varied based on the different regions and different industry groups. Key knowledge gaps included, which soil health indicators should I monitor if I'm trying to track soil health? How do these relate to functions that I care about, things like yield, nutrition, disease resistance? And then what's the return on investment in investing in new practices? And so we also tried to do short and long-term milestones for each of these industry groups related to, how to value soil health in the marketplace, how to kind of create more simple monitoring of soil health, making equipment more accessible and affordable. So, and we're continuing to kind of follow up. It's been about 4 years now since these initial listening sessions. So we're kind of continuing to follow up and see, where have we come over the last few years and where do we still need to go? So one question that was put out, when I first started my job about 4 years ago was like, how healthy are Washington soils and systems? And it's kind of hard to know sometimes how healthy things are, unless, of course, there's a clear health concern that's showing up. So these are just some examples. This is an onion field that I was out in a couple of years ago, and is this a pH issue? Is this a salinity issue? Is this a disease issue? Is it a nematode issue? There's clearly something going on, but some diagnostic tools need to be used. We have a raspberry system here where the main challenge is really erosion and compaction. Wine grape systems are interesting because their goals are maybe different than a lot of other systems. The goals of many other cropping systems are to maximize yield while minimizing the inputs. But for a lot of wine grape systems, they are not trying to maximize yield. So what sort of outcomes are we looking for a wine grape system, for example? That the soil health outcome might be different in different places. And of course, there's going to be different limitations and challenges in each system. So this is just another example from our potato systems. What were the top soil health concerns? And the very top soil health concerns are soil-borne disease and parasitic nematodes. And so, we also have to ask the question, are our soil health assessments addressing these soil health concerns? Do the indicators that we use address these primary concerns? So some cross-cutting themes, again, were soil health measurements and metrics that are standardized, inexpensive, and easily deployed. This is what was identified as being needed. And then another one that we're addressing with our State of the Soils assessment is improved knowledge of soil health specific to production systems. And so I also want to just highlight that another part of the Soil Health Initiative was developing this network of long-term research sites. So we're hoping this is the most densely populated network of long-term sites focused on agricultural research. And several of these, I'm managing this WSU Mount Vernon site here, which was developed a couple of years ago. A couple others have come online this year, and then others are going to be started next year. And they really each addressed systems representing different areas of our roadmap and the key concerns that came up during those listening sessions. So complementing this, these long-term research efforts and the road mapping efforts is this State of the Soils assessment, which I've been leading along with Dr. Jani Gilardi over the past few years. Over the last 3 years, we've sampled over 900 fields representing 60 cropping systems. We're measuring a suite of soil health indicators, many of which you're probably familiar with, and representing 30 counties within Washington state. This was initially funded by a specialty crop block grant and then was expanded. So we did kind of a pilot study with the specialty crop block grant. The design was a little bit different, so I'll mention that later. And then we've really expanded it through the funding from the Soil Health Initiative. So the primary objective was to understand how climate, cropping system, and management impact soil health by tracking those indicators of soil health. And this is a map of our current sites that we've sampled. And again, here's a QR code if you are interested in following up more. There's an interactive map where you can filter by different counties or different crop types and see where we've sampled. We're going to soon be putting up some tools where you can actually do some data exploration, but we're not quite there yet. Our second objective was to help producers and ag professionals, just to kind of understand more about assessing soil health and, what do all these indicators mean. We've created reports that kind of explain the different indicators and allow them to interact with the data. And then our third objective is to develop crop and region specific decision support tools. There's been a lot of work in other regions of the US focused on developing, what kind of are the expected range of values that we should see for different indicators, but there's been a lack of this work in the Western US. So we really want to kind of understand, for our soils and systems, what types of range of, permanganate oxidizable carbon do we expect to see. And I want to highlight that there's been a variety of other soil health assessments in other regions, many of which are in the Midwest and North Central region. Here's a few that we've been, reading and learning from, and so we can kind of understand how these assessments were done and integrate it into what we're doing. There's, so this type of assessment isn't basically an unstructured sampling design. It's not randomized, it's not replicated. We're not going and putting trials on farm. We're just sampling the fields that growers point us to and understanding, the history of those fields. So there's a lot of pros to this in terms of being able to capture a wider variety of fields and soil types and situations. But it also, of course, there's a lot of variability. And you need a large data set to be able to kind of parse out what's going on. So we're kind of in the midst of that and trying to grow that data set. So the approach that we took was initially for the pilot study, we had a paired field design. So this was for about 300 of the sites. We had producers choose paired fields that were on similar soil types. So we looked at the soil series and made sure they were matching up. This is an example from two center pivot fields. And so we had them choose one field that they felt was higher soil health. Maybe it yielded better. Maybe they observed that it had less disease, and then one that they felt had lower soil health. And for all of the fields, we randomly generated, we chose an area of the field that was about 15 hectares and randomly generated 5 points. And at each of those 5 points, we took 10 soil probe cores down to 30 centimeters. And then we composited all of the soil from each field. For the kind of expanded soil health assessment data set, we didn't do the paired field design, but we worked closely with the farmers to kind of learn about which fields they were interested in having a sample. The reason we did this paired field design was to look at whether the farmer perception of their fields aligned with the soil health indicator values that we were measuring. So just starting to explore the data, this is showing all of our data points on a texture triangle. This is all of the data points are in gray, and this is just an example of in a interactive report how we would highlight the fields that were for that farmer, and in the dark gray are ones representing the same county or crop. And so just looking at some distributions of the data, we see, maybe not unsurprisingly, that there's big differences in water holding capacity by textural class, which again is not surprising given that clay content really impacts water holding capacity. But maybe surprisingly, we didn't see any major differences in total organic carbon by textural class. So we do know that texture does play a role in terms of the saturation point of sequestering carbon in the soil, but clearly management may be playing a role here as well. We do see some fields in this fine textural class that have a little bit higher carbon, but not some major differences. And we found that indicators of mineralizable carbon and permanganate oxidizable carbon aligned with this distribution of total organic carbon. Sorry, this is a little bit out of order, but I meant to mention that we did, for all of the fields, we conducted grower interviews and surveys, getting information about rotational history, tillage practices, irrigation, amendments, soil challenges, yields. We weren't able to get yields from everyone, but we've tried to collect yield data as much as possible. So going back to kind of looking at the distribution of the data, one thing we wanted to work on that we are still working on is developing scoring curves for Washington. And so this is a scoring curve from Cornell based on their data set from the northeastern US on permanganate oxidizable carbon. And you can see that, in this kind of very good area in the top 20%, they're between 600 and 1200 ppm of POC. However, when we look at distributions of our data, particularly in the dryland region of Eastern Washington, we see that there are 0% of the fields fall within this range. So does this mean that in this area, all of these soils are unhealthy, or do we just need to shift our metrics, our kind of baseline of how we're assessing the soil health of these fields? So we are working on developing cumulative scoring functions based on these distributions for all of the different regions as we get enough data over time. So that also leads us to think about, what's the best way to categorize soils? Is the best way to categorize them by these textural classes of coarse, medium, and fine, which is what's commonly done? Or should we look at the MLRAs, for example, the major land use resource areas? So this is just looking at some distributions by these MLRAs. I apologize for the color scheme. I was trying to align on my graphs with this map, but there's a lot of brown. But you can see that in the clay content and the water holding capacity, again, there's one region, which is this region over here, that has a much higher clay content, which is really going to impact those physical properties like water holding capacity. But we do see that the mineralizable carbon here and the permanganate oxidizable carbon here are less impacted by that textural component. So again, management practices are maybe playing a role in these kind of more dynamic indicators of soil health. We're also exploring soil health strata, which is something that the Soil Health Institute has worked on. They haven't published it yet, but it looks at the taxonomic class of each of the soils and pulls out things like the physiochemical reactivity, the depth to water table, and the texture, and creates a strata. So that may be another way that we can use to kind of divvy up the different regions of the state or the Western region to develop scoring functions that are relevant to those soil types. So I mentioned that we did management surveys, and we are working to look at trends of, how do different management practices that might have been adopted impact soil health indicators. So there's one thing we've looked at is disturbance in potato systems. So there's a lot of potatoes grown in Washington, and potatoes are just kind of inherently high disturbance. There's a lot of digging, and they're an underground crop. And so one thing we're looking at is how do the rotational crops, or maybe the level of disturbance in those rotational crops, impact the soil health outcomes. Maybe you can't change that much of the disturbance in the potato year, but maybe you can affect the disturbance in the intervening years. So we've used a generalized tillage intensity rating, which is a modified STIR rating, to assess the correlation of that. This generalized tillage intensity rating is, again, something that the Soil Health Institute has been working on, and it's currently unpublished, but they are gathering data sets to use this rating. And it's based on an implement factor, the number of passes, depth, and the area of the field tilled within a 5-year history. The only thing it's leaving out from the STIR rating is the ground speed of the equipment. So we looked at the relationships of the G tier along the x-axis here with water holding capacity and bulk density, and all of our variety of indicators. I'm just showing a snippet here. In 2 different potato growing regions of Washington. And we found that in the Columbia Basin, which is the central region of Washington, we found that there's a trend where higher GTIR, so more disturbance over a 5-year period, is reducing or is correlated with lower water holding capacity. And we saw kind of the opposite, that higher GTIR in Columbia Basin correlates with higher bulk density. So there's a lot of factors going on. We did control for clay content in these relationships, but there's a lot of variables, but we are seeing this significant trend in the Columbia Basin with higher disturbance over time. We did not see any relationship between tillage and these indicators in the Skagit Valley, which may be due to soil type or other factors. But again, this is kind of a start to some of the ways we're looking at this data. And we're going to be pulling out more here, but here's kind of a snippet of what we're looking at. And then we also focused another kind of sub-study on vineyards. I mentioned kind of the unique challenges and goals of wine grape systems. So this is looking at the effects of compost application in vineyards on several different parameters. We have kind of a small data set here, only about 70 fields, but we see that the permanganate oxidizable carbon does tend to be higher in fields that have had compost applied. There's a slight trend for higher total organic carbon and potentially mineralizable nitrogen in fields with compost, but there's a lot of noise and no significant effects there. But that permanganate oxidizable carbon could be an indicator that there's more stabilization of carbon going on in those fields with compost application. Compost, there's some concerns with salinity in compost applied vineyards. So we looked at EC, but did not find any trends where overall the fields with compost had higher salinity. So another thing we're looking at is aggregate stability. You may be aware that there's a lot of different methods that are used to measure aggregate stability, and this measurement of water stable aggregates with a series of sieves, typically sand correction is done, which makes sense because you don't want to be necessarily counting gravels or sand particles as aggregates. But we do find in these very coarse soils, it may be a little odd to report out, a median of 95% aggregate stability in a soil that has, 90% sand. So one thing we're looking at is this, the sand correction and the effect it has on the interpretation of these results. If we look at the same data without sand correction, we find that the median for the coarse soils is around 57% water stable aggregates. So, how should this be interpreted? And I think it really comes down to function, what function we care about in terms of aggregate stability. If the function of interest is water infiltration or erosion control, then the sand corrected water stable aggregate may be relevant because, if there's higher water stable aggregates in coarse soils, there's, coarse soils are going to have better water infiltration and erosion control because that larger, that sand-sized aggregate is going to, serve the same function as a sand-sized particle. But if the function of interest is really carbon protection, then, it might be misleading to have a sand-corrected value because coarse soils are not going to be able to create those aggregates to protect as much carbon as a fine textured soil. So this just highlights some of the ways we're looking at the data currently. We've also, as I mentioned, created these interactive reports for farmers so that they can explore how their fields relate to others of the same crop or the same county, and then the overall distribution of all of the fields we've sampled in the state. And then we've tried and provide snippets of what these indicators mean. I think there's still a lot of work going on in the soil science community to understand what all of these indicators mean and what functions they relate to. But we try to synthesize this and point them towards resources that they can, learn more about what POC is and how they might think about it in terms of their soils. And then we're working with soil testing labs to kind of optimize we have several soil testing labs that are just starting to offer these indicators. So we're working with them to optimize the methods and the reporting of these values and interpretation. An example of why this is needed is we actually in the pilot study had, for some of the indicators, used a different lab than we did for the larger study. So for an indicator like ACE protein, where you might think that the method is the same used across all of these labs, we actually found very different distributions between different labs that were used, which is, concerning. And then when we dug into it a little bit more, we realized that one of the labs was using a slightly different incubation time or slightly different parameters. So, even basic steps like that, where there's consistency in methods across regional labs, I think is really important, and a step that we kind of had to go back a step and work with the labs to understand why they had changed the incubation time and how we can get different labs in the same area to really kind of be consistent with their methods. And I know there's working groups going on nationally to create more standardized protocols for these different indicators. So some next steps for this project is, continue data analysis to understand regional trends and management impacts. We have a lot of data and a lot of management surveys that we are still synthesizing, and a lot of work to kind of parse it out to still understand for these different cropping systems, what are the impacts on soil health indicators. We're also working on publishing a database and data exploration tools that will be on the State Department of Ag's website. We're also going to publish an R package so that other people can use the R package to create interactive soil health reports that follow the model that we've created. So it might be a useful tool for some extension educators. You can just spit some data into the R package and it'll create a report that you can share with farmers. And then, I think generally work that needs to go on in the soil health world is working to tie these indicators to important outcomes in cropping systems. So, in these assessments, we're using indicators to relate to function, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done to determine whether these indicators actually relate to the outcomes that, farmers and agricultural professionals and researchers and policymakers want to see in our agricultural systems. Things like reduced chemical use, increased crop yield, farm profit, air quality, water quality, and reduced erosion and reduced disease. So, are the indicators we're using the best ones to relate to these outcomes, and what other measurements need to be done to determine whether these ecosystem services are actually being accomplished. So lots more work to be done. I do want to mention that we're hiring a couple of positions. I'm hiring a postdoctoral research associate to work with me on this large data set and help us work with this data set, look at management effects on soil health indicators, look at the distributions by region, and really help us kind of synthesize this and create decision support tools. So there's a few more days to apply for that if you know of anyone who's interested. And then the State Department of Ag is also hiring an agronomist to work on reducing nitrate pollution and reducing the greenhouse gas footprint of irrigated agriculture in Washington. So just a couple of shout outs there if you know anyone who might be interested in those positions. And then I wanted to just close with mentioning, if you're interested in following more about the work that the Washington Soil Health Initiative is doing, you can follow our newsletter here, which comes out quarterly. We're pretty active on social media at WSU Soil Health. And then we hold a conference every year, a virtual conference that's really trying to be relevant nationally. This is the flyer from last year, but it'll come up again this coming February. And if you're interested in looking at any of the recordings from past sessions, you can go to the CSANR YouTube channel here and rewatch all of the presentations that went on. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions, and you can feel free to follow up with me also via email and on social media as well.
Great, thank you so much, Deirdre. So that we do have a few questions in the chat box. The first one is from Christine. It says, "This is so great. Would you talk a little bit about how you recruited farmers to be part of your study?"
Yes, absolutely. You're not seeing my screen share anymore, right? I just
No.
wanted to make sure. Okay, great. Yeah, so the initial study that was with the specialty crop block grant focused on 7 specialty crop systems. And so we really worked with, county extension folks that work directly with those industries. We worked with, we put flyers out at various regional conferences. Through the commodity commissions, we really just tried to get the word out, making personal visits to folks. So it was advertised widely, but then we kind of, reached out to specific people that we thought might be interested. And then, a lot of them have allowed us to sample on different fields each year. And then for the wider effort, again, a lot of outreach through various listservs and promotional events, but also through the conservation district. So in the second year, we really started partnering with the conservation districts, and they really connected us with a lot of people that were interested, and they also helped us sample. Since my team couldn't handle it all, we kind of expanded and had them help sample. So yeah, those were the main ways that we really kind of got people interested.
All right, great, thank you. So Manab asks, what kind of compost was applied to the field?
Yeah, so it really varied, and that's something that in that analysis of the effect of compost application, there's a lot of, we aggregated that into just, yes, there was compost application, or no, there wasn't. But within that, we're sampling across about 20 different vineyards. So some people are using yard waste compost, some people are using manure-based compost, some people are just using it once. We kind of, I think we said it was a yes if they'd used it in the last 10 years. Some people are applying it more frequently. Some people are doing it at different rates. So it really varied. And that's something that with a larger data set, we would be able to kind of parse out a little bit more. If we had more, higher sample number, we'd be able to look at manure-based compost versus, yard waste-based compost, and maybe different rates. But with that vineyard study specifically, that data set didn't allow us to do that. So I can't answer your question directly. I think with vineyards, there's mostly manure-based composts that are used, probably just because of the regional availability.
So being in that manure realm, I understand the reason for that question. And one of the projects that we've seen, and a lot of the manure research that we've seen, doesn't always report 100% of what exactly kind of manure that they applied. And so my follow-up question to that is you're keeping track of those things, so later if you decide to go back, you can really separate all of those different pieces out and
exactly. Yeah. So when we do these interviews, we ask all the kind of nitty-gritty details of application rate and type and everything. And then that, when we have our management data sheet, there's kind of different levels of specificity. And so we're hoping as this data set grows that we can start to answer more of those specific questions.
All right. Another question from Shannon. Have you found a uniform understanding of what soil health means and or soil health goals among producers or other collaborators that you've worked with?
Yeah, that's a great question. That was something that came out in the roadmap, was that the stakeholders that we talked to really felt like there was not a uniform definition, and felt like that was a key thing that needed to be addressed. And Yeah, and I don't know if that's why that is. I mean, I guess we often go to the NRCS definition. And so, maybe there's more education that needs to be done around there, but I think it is just different with everyone, not different, completely with everyone, but there's just different challenges that are going to be most present for different people. And so the health concern is going to be different in different systems. So I think we can, use an overall definition of, the soil is supporting the resilience and productivity of the crops, the people around that field, the environment around that field, kind of, win-win-wins. But I think that when it comes to health concerns, just like people might have different health concerns, different systems are going to have different problems and it might mean that maybe we need to track those indicators related to those problems more closely than others.
Yeah, I would agree that soil health is not really just a one size fits all situation.
Yeah.
So, all right. So the next question then is from Madeline. What crops are the potatoes rotated with in the two regions that you studied? She's wondering if that could be influencing both the GTIR and the relationship between GTIR and water holding capacity and bulk density.
Yeah, definitely. So, excuse me. So the regions are very different, those different potato regions. So in the Columbia Basin, which is, it's much more coarse textured soils, much drier. They tend to rotate with other maybe high intensity crops like sweet corn or onions. There's some wheat in there and field corn, and there's some grass seed as well, but usually it's other kind of high intensity crops. So I think those did tend to have higher GTIR ratings overall. That was reflected in that. And I think also part of the reason that those might be more responsive might be related to the texture of the soil and the organic matter content. Those tend to be very low in organic matter and very coarse. So maybe a slight change in management might make the soil more responsive to increasing water holding capacity. In the Skagit region, they do tend to be rotated maybe a little more with small grains like barley and wheat, and there's some growers that are doing 3 to 5 year grass rotations where they might be grazing that. So there's more organic matter inputs in that region, and it's also a much finer textured soil, which I think might be the reason we're not seeing that same response to water holding capacity, because it tends to have higher water holding capacity already. One thing we do see a big challenge with in that region is compaction, and we measured bulk density, but it would have been great to measure penetration resistance or drainage in the winter. We were just taking at a snapshot, a one time point measurement in the middle of the summer. So there may be trends that we're just not capturing with our sampling design. I see a question.
Click the button. Suzanne asks, what level of uptake of cover crops do you see across the state, and how does that differ by region and cropping system, assuming it's possible to generalize?
Yeah, I would say there's pretty good adoption of cover cropping or green manuring. One thing we're finding with our management survey also is like, how do people define cover crops? Some growers in the Columbia Basin will put winter wheat over the winter to help with mitigating wind erosion effects. And, they're calling that a cover crop. So, and I'm not saying it's not, but it just, what the cover crop is very different in the different regions. But I'd say there's a lot of interest in that. And that actually, I think green manures and cover cropping were the top soil health practices of interest in the irrigated Columbia Basin. And then over in Western Washington, there's a lot of cover crop adoption. I'm up in that Skagit region, and there's growers that are, really trying to do a lot of cover cropping. It can be challenging to do winter cover cropping here because of the conditions in the shoulder seasons, it's hard to get the cover crop established in time. I'm sure you have similar challenges in your region. But there's a lot of, troubleshooting and playing around and trying to find the right cover crops. And I also work a lot in the very dry regions of central Washington that are not irrigated, and they get about 8 inches of precipitation a year. And even there's a lot of interest in cover cropping and grazing cover crops. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there to help growers figure out the right establishment practices, varieties, termination methods, but definitely a lot of interest.
All right, great. There's just one more comment there, and it's more of a comment than a question. It says, I think this work would be valuable in comparing soil health baseline data in orchard and vineyard systems in relation to immune responses and diseases and pests. And I don't see any other questions. So do you have any other closing comments before we move into the breakout rooms?
Related to that, I absolutely agree. I think there was a study that was done by Tiana DuPont in orchard systems and tree fruit, and she did look at parasitic nematodes and looked at the relationship of these indicators with those outcomes. And we also did measure plant parasitic nematodes in the potato and wine grape systems. We didn't find any trends there, but I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to integrate that kind of disease and pest, those disease and pest questions and observations into these assessments. And I think that's something that our long-term sites across the state are really going to allow us to look at more, more of those mechanistic questions related to disease.
All right, thank you so much. So with that, I want to thank Dr. Griffin LaHue, and I want to take a quick chance to remind everybody that you should sign up to come and visit me in Nebraska at the Soil Health School coming up the 1st of August. And then, Anne, if you want to open us up into the meeting rooms, that would be fabulous.
Okay, the breakout rooms are now open. So you should be able to go to the bottom of your screen and click breakout rooms, and then click the one that makes the most sense to you, whether that's educator, researcher, agency, student, or farmer. If you're not seeing the option to join one of them, let me know and I'm happy to help troubleshoot. For those of you who are not staying for the breakout rooms, feel free to hop off and enjoy the rest of your day. And again, special thanks to Deirdre for taking time today to talk to all of us.